Mm. My name is Nora, and this is the story of how the people who raised me tried to bury me alive. At my brother's wedding, my uncle stood up in front of everyone, pointed at me, and said I was an embarrassment to the family who needed to be handled. By the next morning, I had been cut off from the family business, locked out of accounts that had my name on them, and handed a legal document stripping me of my share of my grandmother's estate. But that was just the beginning. Before it was over, they had forged contracts in my name, hired someone to intimidate me, and tried to take away the one person I was fighting for. And the worst part, there was someone else behind all of it, someone with money and lawyers and a reason to keep me quiet that I didn't understand until it was almost too late. I was drowning in lies older than I knew. But then I found the one thread that unraveled everything. The wedding was supposed to be beautiful, and in a lot of ways, it was. My brother Daniel had been with his fiancée Priya for 4 years, and the venue, a big old colonial estate outside of Richmond, Virginia, was exactly the kind of place our family loved to show off in. White tablecloths, string lights, open bar, the whole thing. I had helped plan it. I had spent 3 weekends driving my mother to florist appointments. I had coordinated the rehearsal dinner, and I had personally hand-addressed 112 envelopes because my mother said my handwriting was the nicest in the family. I sat at the family table next to my cousin Mia, who kept nudging me whenever something went wrong with the seating chart. My Uncle Warren sat across from us. He had always been the kind of man who made a room feel smaller just by walking into it. He had that particular way of smiling that never quite reached his eyes, and he had never liked me, though I had spent most of my life not fully understanding why. My grandmother Rose was there too. She was 81 and sharp as a blade, and she loved me in the quiet way some older women love the granddaughters, who remind them of themselves. She had told me once, years ago, that she planned to leave me her house in Charlottesville when she passed. It was the house she had grown up in, the one with the wraparound porch and the apple tree in the backyard that I used to climb as a kid. She had said it in the direct, unambiguous way she said most things, and I had never had reason to doubt her. The speeches happened after dinner. Daniel gave a sweet one about Priya. Her father made everyone cry, and then my Uncle Warren stood up, and I felt Mia go still beside me. He didn't make it obvious at first. He talked about family, about legacy, about the importance of protecting what you've built. He talked about loyalty, and then he turned and looked directly at me and said, in a voice that carried across the entire tent, that there were people in this family who had spent years taking advantage of what others had sacrificed to build, and that it was time for that to stop. The table went quiet. My mother stared at the centerpiece. Daniel looked confused. My grandmother put down her champagne glass and looked at Warren with an expression I couldn't read. I felt heat crawl up my throat. I kept my face still. I wasn't going to give him a reaction in the middle of my brother's wedding in front of 140 people with a photographer circling the tent. I picked up my water glass, took a slow sip, and looked at him calmly. I said very quietly that this probably wasn't the time or the place. He smiled. He said he thought it was exactly the right time. I set my glass down, excused myself from the table, and walked to the edge of the property where the lawn met a row of old oak trees. Mia followed me. She asked if I was okay. I told her I didn't know yet. I told her I'd been paying into the family business management account for 2 years, money I'd earned, money I'd agreed to put in as a co-investor with my uncle when he'd asked me to help stabilize the company's cash flow after a rough quarter. I'd done it because he asked and because I trusted the family. I'd never asked for the money back because he'd told me it would convert to equity when the time was right. I didn't know then what he'd actually been planning. I went back to the reception. I danced with Daniel. I smiled for photos. I hugged Priya and told her she looked incredible, because she did. And I went home that night with a feeling in my chest like a stone settling at the bottom of cold water. The next morning, I woke up to 3 emails. The first was from the Family Businesses Bank informing me that my co-signatory access to the account had been revoked. The second was from a lawyer I had never heard of, representing my uncle, notifying me that my so-called equity contribution was being reclassified as a personal loan that I had failed to repay, and that I owed the business $42,000. The third was for my uncle himself, and it was 2 sentences long. It said that the family had made a decision. It said I should speak to the lawyer. I sat on the edge of my bed and read all 3 emails twice. Then I called my mother. She picked up on the 4th ring and told me in the flat, apologetic tone of a woman who had made her decision long before this moment that Warren had been talking to the family for months, that there were concerns about my intentions, and that she thought it was best if I just let it go and moved on. I asked her what she meant by my intentions. She said she had to go. I called my grandmother next. She picked up on the 1st ring. I told her what had happened. There was a pause, and then she said very carefully that Warren had come to her 2 weeks ago with a stack of documents. She said he had told her I had been mismanaging money connected to the estate, that there were records showing I had borrowed against her property without her knowledge. She said she hadn't believed him, but she had signed some papers because he had told her they were just to protect the estate during an audit. She said she thought I should know. My stomach dropped all the way through the floor. I told her not to sign anything else. I told her to call me before she talked to Warren again. I hung up and sat very still for a long moment, and then I opened my laptop and started pulling every document I could find. My investment agreements, my bank transfers, every email I had from my uncle going back 2 years. Whatever he had shown my grandmother, whatever he was building, I was going to find out. My friend Marcus had been my best friend since college. He was the kind of person who didn't ask too many questions when you showed up at his apartment with a laptop bag and a face like you'd been hit by something, who just handed you coffee and said, "Okay, walk me through it." I drove to his place in Richmond and sat at his kitchen table for 3 hours going through everything. The picture that emerged was this. My Uncle Warren had been slowly positioning himself as the sole legitimate heir to my grandmother's estate for at least 18 months. He had been telling different family members different things. My mother thought I had gone behind everyone's backs. Daniel thought I had borrowed money from the business and refused to pay it back. My grandmother had been told there were legal complications around her property. None of it was true. But he had been careful, patient, and he had started with the people who trusted him most. What he hadn't counted on was that I kept records of everything. Marcus looked at the investment agreement I had signed. He looked at the bank transfer confirmations. He said, "You know this is fraud, right?" I said, "I know." He said, "You need a lawyer." I said, "I know that too." I hired an attorney named Claire within the week. She was methodical and direct, and when I spread everything out on her desk, she took about 15 minutes to read through it before she told me that what my uncle had done was not just ethically wrong, but potentially criminal, and that the reclassification of my equity as a personal loan, without my knowledge or consent, combined with the apparent misrepresentation to my grandmother, gave us significant grounds to move on both the civil and criminal side. She also told me something that stopped me cold. She said that in reviewing the documents my uncle had filed, she had found a name she didn't recognize, a third party who appeared to have provided legal and financial backing to my uncle's efforts. The name was a man named Douglas Hale. I had never heard of Douglas Hale. Claire said she was going to look into it. I drove back to Marcus's apartment and told him, and he was already typing before I finished the sentence. It didn't take long to find the surface of it. Douglas Hale was a real estate developer based in Northern Virginia, with investments in commercial properties across the Mid-Atlantic region. On paper, there was nothing obviously connecting him to my grandmother's house. But then Marcus found it, a planning document filed with the county 2 years earlier, listing a parcel of land in Charlottesville, the same address as my grandmother's home, as part of a proposed mixed-use development project. The application had been put on hold pending a state resolution. I felt the cold move from my stomach into my chest. My grandmother's house wasn't just a house. It was sitting on 2 acres in a part of Charlottesville that had become extremely valuable in the last 5 years, and someone had been waiting for her to die, or for her estate to become contested enough that it could be bought out at below market value during litigation. My uncle wasn't just trying to cut me out. He had been paid to. I called my grandmother that night and I told her everything. Not gently, directly, all of it, the way she would have wanted. There was a long silence when I finished. Then she said, in the voice she used when she had already made up her mind, that Warren had always reminded her of her brother Clifford, who had spent 40 years trying to take what wasn't his and died with nothing because of it. She said she wanted to speak with my lawyer. I arranged the call for the next day. What I didn't know was that my uncle had someone watching me. I found out the hard way. The way you find out about a lot of things. Too late and all at once. I was at Marcus's apartment, going through financial records with Claire on a video call, when Marcus came in from checking the mail and held up an envelope. He said it had been sitting on top of his mailbox, not in it, just sitting there. It had my name on it, no postage, no return address. Inside was a single printed page. It said, "You're making this harder than it needs to be. Walk away from the estate claim and we'll call the loan forgiven. Push further and we'll make sure the court sees everything we have on you." I read it twice and then handed it to Marcus. He read it and said, "What do they have on you?" I said, "Nothing, because there's nothing to have." He said, "So they're bluffing." I said, "I think so, but I need to know for certain." Claire filed a police report the next day. The officer was polite and took a statement and told us that without more identifying information about who sent it, there wasn't much they could do immediately. But she told us to document everything, save everything, and call her if anything escalated. It escalated within the week. My grandmother called me on a Tuesday evening, and she sounded shaken in a way that I had never heard from her before, which scared me because she was not a woman who shook easily. She said that Warren had come to her house that afternoon with a man she didn't know, and that the man had sat across from her at her own kitchen table and told her in a pleasant voice that the simplest resolution for everyone was for her to deed the Charlottesville property to the business trust that Warren controlled, and that if she did, all of the estate complications would go away cleanly. She said she had told him she needed to speak with her own attorney. She said the man had smiled and said she was welcome to, but that courts moved slowly and that she was 81 years old. I was in my car within 10 minutes. I drove to Charlottesville, spent the night on her couch, and in the morning I sat with her and called Claire. And we filed an emergency motion to have my grandmother's existing legal documents reviewed for coercion and for Warren's access to her estate planning accounts frozen pending investigation. Claire also filed a formal complaint about the visit from the unknown man as possible elder financial exploitation, which in Virginia carries serious legal weight. By the end of that week, 3 things happened in quick succession. First, my uncle's lawyer filed a countermotion accusing me of manipulating my grandmother. Second, a mutual family acquaintance sent me a text saying she had heard I had been stealing from the family business for years, which told me Warren was doing to me what the original video's father had done, controlling the story he was feeding to people around me. Third, Marcus called me and told me to check my credit report immediately. I checked it. There were 2 hard inquiries I hadn't initiated and 1 new account. A line of credit opened 4 days earlier attached to my social security number with an address I didn't recognize. I called my bank's fraud line while I was still staring at the screen. I froze my credit within the hour. I called Claire next, and she said calmly that this had just moved into unambiguous criminal territory and that she was filing an additional complaint with the state attorney general's office. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay on my grandmother's couch and listened to the house settle, and I thought about Douglas Hale, sitting somewhere in an office in Northern Virginia, calculating the value of this old house with the apple tree in the backyard, and my Uncle Warren, who I had trusted because he was family. And I thought about how patient they had both been and how they had almost gotten away with it. I was almost asleep when my grandmother appeared in the doorway in her robe. She sat down in the armchair across from the couch and didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "There is something I didn't tell you." I sat up. She said that about 3 years ago, Warren had come to her with a proposal. He had said he had a business contact who was interested in the Charlottesville property and who would pay well above market for it. She had said no. He had come back 6 months later with a different proposal, and she had said no again. She said she hadn't told me because she hadn't thought it was serious. She said she was telling me now because she thought I should know exactly who we were dealing with. I asked her if she had anything in writing from those conversations. She went to her bedroom and came back with a shoebox. Inside were letters, actual handwritten letters from Warren, dated over a period of 2 years, pressing the case for selling in increasingly urgent language. In the last one, dated 14 months ago, he had written that he was confident the estate could be resolved expeditiously if she would simply give him limited power of attorney to act on her behalf. She had never signed that. But the letters showed exactly how long this had been planned. I photographed every single one and sent them to Claire at midnight. She sent back one word: perfect. What happened next took about 6 weeks, and it was not quick or clean or dramatic the way things are in movies. It was slow and exhausting, and there were days when I drove back to Richmond and sat in Marcus's apartment and felt like I was already losing. But Claire was methodical, and she was good. And bit by bit the picture she built in the court filings became impossible to ignore. The forensic accountant she hired found evidence that Warren had been billing my grandmother's estate for consulting fees for over a year, fees that had no corresponding work, money that had been quietly redirected to a holding company connected to Douglas Hale's development group. The fraudulent line of credit opened in my name was traced back through IP logs to a device registered to one of Warren's employees. The letters my grandmother had saved filled in the timeline of intent, and Claire found one more thing: a text message chain obtained through discovery between Warren and Hale, in which Warren explicitly stated that once the elder granddaughter's claim was neutralized, the estate transfer could proceed on schedule. The elder granddaughter. That was me. The day I walked into that courtroom, I felt nothing like what I had expected. I had thought I would feel nervous or angry or vindicated. Instead, I felt very clear and very quiet, the way you feel when you have done everything you could possibly do and now you just have to let it land. Claire laid out the case methodically and without drama: the fraudulent fees, the identity theft, the documented history of manipulation, the text messages, the letters in the shoebox, the fact that Douglas Hale had a signed letter of intent for the Charlottesville property, signed, we discovered, 2 years before my grandmother's health had even become a consideration. Warren sat at the opposite table, and I watched him go still and smaller as each piece of evidence was entered. His lawyer objected several times. The judge overruled each one. The judge issued her ruling at the end of that afternoon. Warren's conservatorship petition was denied. The fraudulent business loan claim against me was dismissed. All of Warren's access to my grandmother's estate accounts was revoked immediately, pending full criminal investigation. The court found sufficient grounds to refer the matter of elder financial exploitation to the state attorney general. Douglas Hale was not in that courtroom, but his lawyers were, and when the judge finished reading, they looked at each other and I could see the moment they understood what was coming. My grandmother was sitting 2 rows behind me, wearing the same pearl earrings she had worn at my brother's wedding. When the judge finished, I turned around and she was already looking at me. She didn't smile because she was not a woman who smiled reflexively. She just nodded once, the way she did when something happened exactly as she had expected it to. Outside on the courthouse steps, Marcus said, "You did it." I shook my head. I said, "We did it." He said, "You know your uncle is going to be indicted, right?" I said, "I know." He was. 3 months later, Warren was indicted on 4 counts including wire fraud, elder financial exploitation, and identity theft. Douglas Hale was named as a co-conspirator in a separate filing. Neither of them took the plea offer the first time it was extended. My grandmother is still in her house in Charlottesville, in the house with the wraparound porch and the apple tree. She had her 82nd birthday in the spring, and I drove down and we had cake on the porch, and she told me the same thing she had said at the beginning of all of this: that some men spend their whole lives trying to take what isn't theirs and die with nothing. She said, "Don't let people like that make you small." I drove home that evening with the windows down and the Virginia air coming in warm, and I thought about how long I had spent being careful around my uncle, softening myself at family dinners, making myself easier to dismiss because I thought that was what you did. I thought about all the years I had trusted the structure of family to mean something it didn't. But I also thought about Marcus at his kitchen table at midnight. I thought about Claire's voice on the phone saying, "This just became criminal territory." I thought about my grandmother handing me a shoebox full of letters at midnight in her living room. I thought about the fact that the only reason any of it worked was that I had kept records, stayed calm, and refused to disappear when someone powerful told me to. For years, I had moved quietly through spaces that were supposed to belong to me and never quite acted like they did. I had made myself smaller so that my uncle could make himself larger. I had absorbed his contempt at a wedding table and walked away to preserve the peace at an event that wasn't about me. I was done with that. No one, not family, not money, not a man with a letter of intent and a development plan, gets to decide what you're worth or whether your name belongs on what's yours. You fight back with documentation and lawyers and whatever quiet, relentless, specific evidence you can find, and you do not stop until the truth is so loud they can't talk over it. If this story sounds anything like something you've lived through, I hope you know you're not alone. Subscribe, because next time I have something to say about it, I want you to hear it. I used to think that family was a structure you could lean against without checking if it was hollow. I spent years assuming that because someone shared your blood and sat at your table and called you by your name, they were on your side in the ways that mattered. It took a wedding speech and a shoebox full of letters and a stranger's name on a development plan to teach me otherwise. What happened to me wasn't random and it wasn't sudden. My uncle had been building that trap for 18 months before he ever stood up at Daniel's wedding and pointed at me in front of 140 people. Every lie he told, every document he quietly altered, every conversation he had with my mother and my grandmother before I knew anything was wrong, all of it required sustained effort, sustained intention. People who deceive on that scale don't stumble into it. They choose it repeatedly over a long period of time, and they count on the people they're deceiving to stay confused and trusting long enough for the plan to work. What I learned is that the only real answer to that kind of calculated dishonesty is equally sustained clarity. Not rage, clarity. Rage burns fast and makes you sloppy. Clarity is what lets you sit down at midnight with a laptop and 2 years of bank records and build something they can't talk their way out of in court. I also learned that the people who try to take what isn't theirs are almost always counting on your reluctance to fight. They count on you feeling like it isn't worth it, like the cost of the battle will outweigh whatever you're protecting, like the discomfort of confronting family is worse than the loss. My uncle was patient because he believed I would eventually decide that the house, the equity, the principle of it wasn't worth the mess. He was wrong, but his calculation wasn't unreasonable. Most people do walk away. Most people absorb the loss quietly and spend years wondering what would have happened if they hadn't. Nora didn't walk away. Not because she was fearless. She had plenty of nights that felt like losing. But because she understood that walking away would not actually make her safe. It would just make her erased more efficiently. There is a kind of courage that isn't dramatic or loud. It's the courage of keeping records, of making one more phone call, of finding a lawyer and spreading everything out on a desk and saying, here is what they did. That kind of courage compounds. Every document you save, every email you don't delete, every decision you make to stay precise instead of emotional. It builds into something that eventually becomes undeniable. Her grandmother understood it too, in the way people who have lived long enough to watch patterns repeat themselves tend to understand things. She said Warren reminded her of her brother, a man who spent his whole life reaching for things that belonged to others and died with nothing. That's not a coincidence. That's a pattern. People who build their gains on what they've taken from others don't get to keep it, not in any permanent way, because the foundation is wrong and eventually something will pull at the thread. You fight back with documentation, with patience, with a refusal to disappear when someone powerful tells you to. You do not let anyone, not family, not money, not a man with a development plan and a letter of intent, decide what belongs to you or whether your name means anything. That's not stubbornness. That's how you stay standing.